Tobacco and Related Products Regulations 2016. Viscount Ridley.
Sir, I would first like to apologise for springing this debate on my noble friend the Minister in particular at such short notice right at the end of a session. But he will appreciate why this is an urgent matter. In 10 days' time, the EU Tobacco Products Directive may become law through a negative statutory instrument recently laid before this House. I'd like to emphasise right at the start that I have no problem with most of the directive. It's just the part relating to e-cigarettes and vaping, parts 6 and 7 essentially, and my motion is a little bit vague on that. The original draft was a little more specific. As noble lords will know, it's long been my view that this directive scores an own goal by bringing in measures that would discourage the take-up of vaping and thereby drive people back to cigarettes or to prevent them quitting. But it's not just me that takes this view. Increasingly, it is the view of Public Health England and of the Royal College of Physicians, whose recent report on this topic is, I think, a game-changer in this debate. So I'm here at the 11th hour to help my noble friend prevent a historic mistake being made, or at least to raise the issue. In passing, let me note that I have nothing to declare. I own no shares and take no income from anything relating to vaping or smoking. The horrific death toll from smoking, 100,000 of our citizens die every year, has touched many of the lives in this room, I suspect. It's the biggest cause of preventable death on a scale that is hard to comprehend. It's a Hillsborough every 8 hours. It's a scourge that deserves the very best of technical ingenuity and policy-making skills to solve. Vaping offers, as the Royal College of Physicians said, a great opportunity to apply to smoking the principle of harm reduction, an idea that was pioneered in this country. When people behave in harmful ways, how do you stop them? You can punish them in the hope of deterrence, as we do with murder and fraud. You can hector them, as we do with alcohol and sugar. Or you can try to offer safer alternatives, which is how we tackled HIV infection and heroin addiction in this country in particular, and is how we should, I believe, now deal with tobacco. In the case of addictions, where people find it genuinely very hard to resist temptation, harm reduction surely makes sense. Britain is probably the world's leading vaping nation. Virtually all of South America has banned the practice entirely at the behest of the tobacco industry. In America, it's largely demonised, and quite a lot of people don't know what it is. Almost all of the 2.6 million vapers in Britain are smokers or ex-smokers, and the quit rate for those trying vaping is faster, greater than for nicotine replacement therapies or cold turkey cessation. This is, in other words, a public health revolution, and it's costing the taxpayer nothing. By saving smokers a fortune, rewarding entrepreneurs and averting ill health, it's boosting the economy. But we have before us a piece of legislation that strangles that breakthrough in red tape. It's the product of big company lobbying and backroom deals in Brussels. It is legislation which last month the Department of Health admitted in its impact assessment risks increasing, not reducing, the amount of smoking. And I hope in his remarks today the Minister will be fully candid and accept that this part of this directive is a mess which does not deserve defending, but does need ameliorating. I've alerted him already to 3 specific matters that I'm seeking clarity on. First, given that the Royal College of Physicians last month told the government that it should promote vaping to smokers, quotes, as widely as possible, unquotes, what new emphatic and unambiguous statement will the Minister make in support of vaping? Second, given that the Department estimates that the Tobacco Product Directive rules will ban 90% of advertising but would have helped to promote this switching, what budget has the Department specifically set aside for a public information campaign to encourage smokers to move to vaping, as the Royal College and Public Health England both want? And third, given that the regulatory burden that the Department is about to place on the industry is so extreme that his officials estimate, at least this is the only estimate in their impact assessment, that the number of notifiable products will be reduced by 96% from 25,000 to possibly as low as 1,000, what expenditure will the Department make to specifically reduce the cost of the onerous testing regime on the industry? I would ask the Minister to avoid repeating the erroneous suggestion his officials have been making that any of the £13 billion of public health benefits that his department surmises will come from the Tobacco Products Directive would be the result of Article 20, or at least Section 6 and 7 of these regulations. In its impact assessment, table on page 45, the Department has not been able to quantify a single benefit from vaping regulation. A little bit of context, my lords. At the beginning of this decade, attempts to reduce smoking were stalling. We taxed the habit to the point where the main beneficiaries were black market traders. We barred smoking from every public building. Nicotine patches were proving unpopular with smokers. Then along comes a technological breakthrough, thanks to a man who I've met named Hon Lik, working in central China, something that gives a nicotine hit in the same fashion as smoking, but is far, far safer and cleaner. It's a fantastic piece of luck, or rather ingenuity. As the Prime Minister told the other place in December, vaping has now helped more than 1 million people in this country to stop smoking altogether. How safe is vaping? We know that concentrations of harmful and potentially harmful constituents, such as carbonyl compounds, tobacco-specific nitrosamines, polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, and other constituents, are in the order of 1,500 times higher in cigarette smoke than in vapour. A well-controlled trial has recently been carried out by Grant O'Connell and colleagues working for the vaping manufacturer Fontem Ventures. They asked 15 smokers to give up altogether for 5 days, another 15 to vape only for 5 days, and another 15 to mix vaping and smoking for 5 days. They measured the harmful and potentially harmful constituents in the urine, blood and breath of each group. The results were striking. After 5 days, the vapors' carboxyhemoglobin levels, that's an indication of how much carbon monoxide they had in their system, had dropped by 83%, which was actually an even bigger drop than in the cold turkey cessation group, where it had dropped by 75%. Even the dual users had seen a drop of 23%. The amount of carbon monoxide they exhaled had halved in both the vapours and the cessation group. Much the same was true for all the other biomarkers, except, of course, nicotine. In terms of harmful constituents, vaping, in other words, is almost indistinguishable from not smoking at all. Both Public Health England and the Royal College of Physicians agree that it is much safer than smoking. As far as we can tell, nicotine addiction without smoking is about as dangerous as caffeine addiction. Vaping, my lords, is therefore a public health triumph that the Department of Health has, to its extreme shame, done its utmost to block. In 2010, the Department's medicines regulator, the MHRA, tried to completely ban vaping devices. In 2013, the agency, which is financed largely by the pharmaceutical industry, tried to insist that every e-cigarette should be licensed as a medicine. This would again have amounted to a de facto ban. After 6 years of trying, the agency has so far only managed to license one e-cigarette, which is still not available to the public. So if the Department of Health had its way, there would not be 25,000 varieties of vaping product on the market today, but 0. The only winners of the Department of Health policy prescriptions would be undertakers. Thankfully, and my noble friends will know how painful it is for me to say this, thankfully the European Parliament voted down the folly of exclusive medicinal regulation. But it did not vote down the rest of Article 20 of the Tobacco Products Directive, which in that wonderfully undemocratic way is now to be enforced upon us. The truth is that these regulations were scripted in Brussels by pharmaceutical companies desperately trying to protect the sales of their widely unloved nicotine replacement therapies. What we have before the House is still a piece of legislation that is not fit for purpose. When even the Department of Health says that it risks increasing smoking, then we know that we're facing a moral responsibility as legislators to review this in great detail. It most certainly should not be just nodded through. It is no defence to say that some regulation is required. No sensible person would argue against us knowing what is going into e-liquids and what comes out in vapour. Potential toxins should be tested, as happens with food, cosmetics and other consumer products. But as the Department admitted in a parliamentary answer, far more adverse incidents are reported by doctors about pharmaceutical nicotine replacement therapies than e-cigarettes. At most, a bit of tidying up of the testing process was needed. Let me put 3 more questions to my noble friend the Minister. The Royal College of Physicians describes the big warning labels which will deter smokers from using vaping devices as being, quotes, illogical. Does the Minister agree with the Royal College on this? The ban on stronger vaping devices, the very ones most likely to wean heavy smokers into vaping, was criticised 2 years ago by a dozen scientists writing to the Commission, which ignored their advice. Economists now predict that 105,000 extra deaths every year across Europe will result from the ban on stronger devices. Does the Minister agree with this estimate, and if not, what is his estimate? Thirdly, the directive proposes that to cut down the risks of children starting smoking, it is necessary to create a minimum cigarette packet size of 20. Yet it imposes a maximum size for vaping devices. And this miniaturisation will raise prices and generate more packaging waste. Where is the logic in making the most successful substitute to tobacco more difficult to use? My Lords, the Minister has a choice. He could blame Brussels and say this is now a good reason to quit the EU in order to help people quit smoking. An awful lot of the country's vapers, who are natural libertarians, are beginning to take that view. And to dream of the day after Brexit when Britain abolishes the Tobacco Products Directive and goes back to pioneering the virtual elimination of smoking and its replacement by something much less harmful. Or, if the Minister does not wish to turn this into a referendum issue, he can have a very quick rethink and try to alter the implementation of the directives. My Lords, we have a statutory instrument before us, about a third of which is devoted to stifling and exciting innovation that is saving lives.
The question is that this motion be agreed to.
My Lords, I'd like to thank my noble friend Vicar for raising this issue today, and like my noble friend, I intend to concentrate solely upon e-cigarettes and vaping. I have no views whatsoever on the rest of the directive. I must, unlike my noble friend, declare a fairly major interest in this subject, in that I smoked 20 cigarettes a day, a packet a day, for the best part of 50 years. I tried a number of different ways of giving up patches, chewing gum and willpower, none of which worked until 2 years ago when I took up using an e-cigarette, and I have not had a cigarette since. So I can very pleased to hear the health benefits which my noble friend has described, which I hope I am now enjoying, and I'm very pleased also that I now have the endorsement of the Royal College of Physicians and Public Health England in my course of action. And it is, I believe, recognised by the Department of Health as the #1 tool for helping smokers give up. I don't have the figures, I don't know if my noble friend does, but I would estimate that 99% of people who smoke e-cigarettes are those who are trying or have given up smoking real cigarettes. I cannot really believe that anybody would start using an e-cigarette if they hadn't smoked an ordinary cigarette beforehand, but maybe there are some people who have, I don't know. I can also tell you, your lordships, that it is extremely good for the pocket as well as the health, in that I believe 20 cigarettes now cost something like £9 a packet, a large amount of which goes to the Treasury, of course. And so I was spending £9 a day on cigarettes, whereas now I use a nicotine liquid, which comes in a little 10 millilitre bottle, which costs £5 and lasts me a whole week. So it's very good for my pocket. But also, my lords, I understand that nowadays a large proportion of cigarette smokers do come from the lower income categories of people, and therefore it would be a great benefit to them if they were able to give up smoking cigarettes. I would like confirmation, by the way, from my noble friend, I hope he can give it to me, that the type of liquid I use, nicotine liquid, which is 1.1%, and in 10 millilitre little plastic bottles, will not be banned by this new regulation. I would only conclude by saying that this directive in regard to e-cigarettes was dreamt up in 2012, which actually was quite a long time ago, before I'd heard of e-cigarettes, and I suspect before most people had heard of e-cigarettes. Yet, but like a lot of things which come from Brussels, there was absolutely no adaptation to the fact that e-cigarettes are now recognised as being a good thing rather than a bad. So I hope my noble friend can give me an assurance that the damage limit, he will do all he can to limit the damage that this directive might have on people who are trying to give up smoking.
My Lords, can I also pay tribute to the work that my friend Viscount Ridley has done in terms of getting this debate before us today. And it has a great sense of déjà vu about it, as far as I'm concerned, because I was one of the people in the European Parliament that he referred to that helped to get the original decision made against this directive and against the restrictions on e-cigarettes. And I was also the shadow rapporteur for my group and part of the European Parliament negotiating team that sat there until about 11:30 at night in the Berlaymont, with the Commission chairing it and the Council on the other side of the table, trying to thrash out the very messy compromise that you see before us now in the Tobacco Products Directive. And again, I had no difficulty with the vast majority of the directive. My concern was the sections on e-cigarettes. And before I started working on this, I had no particular knowledge of the subject. But when any dossier is faced before you, the first thing you start doing is reading all of the various publications that they're all listening to all the lobbying and advice and being contacted by constituents. And I was first alerted to it when my email inbox started to fill up with literally hundreds of emails from people all over the country and indeed all over Europe, concerned that these magical devices that they had used to give up smoking were either going to be banned or face severe restrictions. And together with a number of MEPs from all sides, from Liberal Democrats and from the Labour Party in the UK, we started a campaign to try and improve the directive. And I have to say we weren't helped in this particularly by Department of Health officials. Many times I tried to speak to ministers about it to find out who was actually behind the restrictions. Why was there such a campaign on something which seemed to me so self-evidently to provide great public health benefits and harm reduction measures? And I never quite clearly got an answer. I was pointed to a recording of the former Public Health Minister appearing in front of the European Scrutiny Committee of the House of Commons when she was asked why she voted for this directive on behalf of the government, and she turned to her officials and said, but I think the e-cigarette provisions were removed from it, weren't they? Which I think shows a worrying lack of understanding of what she was voting on behalf of the government. Nevertheless, we ended up with the directive. It was a very messy compromise. It was very badly worded, but it's a lot better than it could have been before we campaigned on it. And I think Lord Viscount Ridley is quite right to point out the somewhat murky role of various pharmaceutical interests in producing this. When I started asking questions in the Commission and elsewhere and in the Council about, it seemed to me to be self-evident that these devices were brilliant in terms of reducing tobacco smoking, which is, I thought, what we all wanted. Indeed, why were they even in the directive in the first place? It's called the Tobacco Products Directive. E-cigarettes are not tobacco products in any sense of the word. And the answer came back to me many times that this was argued for, fought for and lobbied for by the pharmaceutical industry, who of course had an awful lot to lose out on if it supplanted and replaced their nicotine patches and gums. I don't know the truth of that, but it seemed to me that they were very successful in getting what they wanted. I agree completely with all the points made by Viscount Ridley and my other colleague, but let me make two additional points. First of all, in terms of advertising, the Royal College of Physicians has a proud history at the heart of tobacco control. Since its first report on smoking and health in 1962, it has been an intellectual leader in the field and is worth listening to. When the headline on the press release on its latest report states in bold capitals, "Promote e-cigarettes widely as a substitute for smoking," we would hope that the government would get the message that 21 world-renowned authors are trying to put across. Yet, we would be wrong if we thought that. For in the regulation that the Department wants us to approve is not the promotion of e-cigarettes, but the suppression of information about e-cigarettes. Paragraph 176 of the Department's impact assessment forecasts that the EU rules will reduce e-cigarette advertising by 90%. And how are smokers supposed to hear about them? In paragraph 167 of the Department nonchalantly claims that cutting advertising will in fact not reduce the number of smokers switching to e-cigarettes. Now, we've heard this before, my lords. We've heard this old argument many times before, not from health officials, but from tobacco company executives trying to pretend that advertising smoking would somehow not increase the amount of smoking. And the messages that we give really matter. In the complex decisions that smokers make every day about whether to smoke or to consume nicotine through much cleaner forms, their perceptions of the relative risks of these products are indeed crucial. The Royal College of Physicians, Public Health England, Action on Smoking and Health have all raised deep concerns about how smokers perceive e-cigarettes to be much more risky than they actually are. Very interesting that Action on Smoking and Health should now say this, because I recall when we were actually dealing with the directive, that was not the message that they were giving at the time. But we're certainly not going to give this message by banning 90% of advertising, and not by insisting on e-cigarette packaging carrying big health warnings, which is what the government is asking us to approve in these regulations. The Royal College of Physicians described the imposition of these warnings as illogical, bearing in mind that nicotine patch boxes do not have to warn of the dangers of nicotine. Much of the problem stems from media reporting of junk science, and the worst example was a headline in the Telegraph in December screaming that e-cigarettes are no safer than smoking tobacco, a nonsense report based on junk science. The second point that I want to raise today is that of novel tobacco products. There has been a number of new products being introduced in this category, particularly products called heat not burn. They're very interesting developments, and there are a range of other alternative products in development as well. Some coming to market, which contain tobacco but work by heating it and not burning it. And the absence of combustion here is the key, because of course we all know, as Viscount Ridley has said, that the harm from smoking is caused primarily through the toxins produced by the burning of that tobacco. In 1976, Professor Michael Russell wrote that people smoke for the nicotine, but they die from the tar, which the recent Royal College of Physicians again reflected in the title of their recent study on e-cigarettes, Nicotine Without Smoke. With such technology developments and a new regulatory basis, with the introduction of the TPD, are the government looking at opportunities from the range of products in addition to e-cigarettes as part of a harm reduction agenda in the new tobacco control plan? My lords, this is truly a terrible piece of legislation, which I plead guilty for playing my part in helping to produce in the first place, but it's not too late to undo some of that harm and to help to increase and encourage the taking up of e-cigarettes and the consequent reduction in tobacco consumption. Instead of trying to restrict e-cigarettes, the government should in fact be trying to positively encourage them. Thank you.
This regulation or directive directly affects me, my health, and indeed my well-being. I started smoking before I was a teenager, building up to about 50 cigarettes a day. I've tried every trick in the book to kick the habit, but nothing seemed to work. I knew it would kill me, that I would be gathered by the grim reaper before my time, but I just couldn't stop. I couldn't kick the habit. Then 2 summers ago, I was in a taxi in a traffic jam, and I was chatting to the driver, and at one point said, "I do wish we could hurry up, because I'm dying for a fag." He turned round with an e-cigarette in his hand and said, "Have you tried one of these?" And I said, "No, what is it?" And he explained that he had tried them and he hadn't had smoked a cigarette since. He kindly wrote down the details for me to Google, but he did insist that if I did try these e-cigarettes, I must try the strongest strength I could get, because if I didn't, I wouldn't get the necessary nicotine hit, and I'd be back on fags in no time at all. I took his advice, using the strongest nicotine, 2.4%, and I haven't looked back. I haven't even had one puff of tobacco since 2 summers ago, rather like my noble friend Lord Brabazon. So, my lords, they do work, and they do help people to stop smoking. My lords, as we've been told, there are 2.6 million people vaping in the UK. 40%, like me, are ex-smokers, and 59% are dual users. They both vape and smoke. And I think your lordships will agree that a single vape is better than a single drag on a fag. Interestingly, only 0.2% of under 18-year-old non-smokers have tried vaping, although continued use is negligible. Research conducted by Cancer Research UK found that smokers who vape are 60% more likely to quit than those that use willpower or over-the-counter nicotine products. My lords, these statistics demonstrate that vaping is used almost entirely, 99%, by current and ex-smokers. 61% of them say the sole reason for vaping is to stop using traditional tobacco products. So why have we got this directive, these regulations? Our masters in Brussels believe that vaping could provide a gateway to smoking, that these tough new laws are necessary to protect non-smokers, particularly children, from using e-cigarettes. But, my lords, as I've tried to explain, there is no evidence for this. 99% of those vaping are current or ex-smokers like me. And as for children, as I said earlier, only 0.2% of under 18-year-old non-smokers have tried vaping. So, my lords, there is no evidence that vaping is a gateway to tobacco, and no evidence that vaping products influence children. And vaping is estimated to be 95% safer than smoking. You would think Brussels would want to encourage vaping. So where do Brussels get their evidence that vaping is harmful? I just don't know. Or have Brussels been got at by the tobacco lobbyists who have seen their sales of traditional tobacco fall, or indeed the pharmaceutical industry, as the noble Lords, Lord Callan and Ridley have already suggested? So, Brussels are banning advertising. E-cigarettes must carry health warnings, and nicotine strengths are to be restricted. To my mind, restricting nicotine strength to 2% will be particularly damaging. And I would say that, as I still use the 2.4%, as do about a quarter of e-cigarette users. By taking up vaping, I hope to keep the Grim Reaper at bay for a little longer. I just hope when I run out of my 2.4 nicotine supply and am forced to use the weaker nicotine, that I don't switch back to smoking. And that is the danger for many users of e-cigarettes. My lords, perhaps by the time I do run out of my 2.4% nicotine supply, stronger nicotine may be available on the black market, with all the dangers that that will entail. My lords, I would like to just use one or two quotes to back up my previous assertions. The Office for National Statistics have said e-cigarettes are almost exclusively used by smokers and ex-smokers. Almost none of those who have never smoked cigarettes were e-cigarette users. Public Health England said there is a need to publicise the current best estimate that using electronic cigarettes is 95% safer than smoking. And they went on to say, encouraging smokers who cannot or do not want to stop smoking to switch to electronic cigarettes could help reduce smoking-related disease, death and health inequalities. This was backed by the Royal College of Physicians, who have said, on the basis of the available evidence, the Royal College of Physicians believes that e-cigarettes could lead to significant falls in the prevalence of smoking in the UK, prevent many deaths and episodes of serious illness. And even the Prime Minister last December said, I think we do need to be guided by the experts. We should look at the reports from the Public Health England, but it is promising to see that overall 1 million people are estimated to have used e-cigarettes to help them quit, or have replaced smoking with e-cigarettes completely. So I think we should be making clear that this is a very legitimate path for many people to improve their health and the health of the nation. Well, quite so. But I don't know what my noble friend the Minister is going to say when he responds, but I expect him to support the regulations and the EU directive. There is very little else he can do. Our masters in Brussels have told us to jump, and sadly the only thing that the British government can do is jump. Until June the 24th, of course.
My Lords, I should first of all declare an interest, because this is a tobacco and related order, since I'm an associate member of the Houses of Parliament Pipe and Cigar Club. I'm an associate member because I'm a non-smoker, so they tolerate me. And I'm pleased to be a member of that association or club because I believe that the attitude towards smoking has been quite absurd in many respects, and measures have been taken against the smoking population, and I'm talking about the adult smoking population, which are not appropriate in a democratic society that should allow adults to make choices about their lifestyles and not to have them dictated to by government. But we're not talking about tobacco today, and I only just saw the noble Viscount Lord Ridley's prayer. Is it a prayer? Perhaps it isn't, but the fact that he has instituted a debate today, and I think he and other noble speakers have really put the case. I think, as far as I'm concerned, there's probably nothing else to say, except to give them support in resisting the government's and, of course, the EU's decisions to restrict a product which is going to assist others from embarking or giving up tobacco smoking. That is almost impossible to believe, that a government which has been so anti-smoking has itself brought in so many anti-smoking measures over the years, and I think I've been involved with them for at least 25 years, should now, when we're on the brink of getting people or assisting people to give up tobacco smoking, they put these very stringent restrictions upon them. Why on earth are they banning the advertising of them? Why on earth are they doing that? If it is to be a health benefit to people who smoke, and the government think ought to give up smoking. That seems to me to be an absolutely absurd position. I'd like to ask whether there have been consultations with the producers of these, they're called e-cigarettes. I think perhaps that was a mistake, because they're not cigarettes. And, you know, anybody who mentions cigarettes are immediately jumped on by the government and the department, and so perhaps it was a mistake to label them cigarettes. They clearly are not cigarettes, and they shouldn't really be treated as such. And what I want to know is whether the people who produce these e-cigarettes have been consulted. Do ministers, or have ministers had discussions with them? Now, I ask that question because the department and the ministers refused even to discuss, to meet to discuss the tobacco companies. Now, perhaps that's understandable, because, of course, the World Health Organization recommends that they shouldn't be given a voice. But in this case, it is something which will help people to give up tobacco. So have they had discussions with the people who produce these? And I'd like to know the answer to that. I think the only other thing I have to say is that I hope the government will listen to this debate. Not much hope of it, in actual fact, because in the past, trying to get the government to listen to reason is like banging your head against a brick wall. It doesn't matter what you say, they've got their policies, and incidentally, when they get into government, they often change them. And I can remember sitting in this room on the other side of the of this chamber, listening to a previous health minister speaking, not voting, but speaking against some of the measures which were being introduced by the Labour Party, like, for example, the hiding of cigarettes behind blinds. He was against that. And indeed, I well remember him meeting the retailers and saying how a Conservative government would see that this was repealed. But of course, they're in government now, and they're in favour and have brought forward this legislation, not about banning a dangerous product like smoking, but banning a product which helps people to stop dangerous smoking. So I do hope that the Noble Lord, the Minister, will listen very carefully to the experiences of people that have spoken in this debate. And to add that, I have met many people, including a relative, who were heavy smokers but have been weaned off smoking by using e-cigarettes. So I do hope, I'm obliged to the Noble Lord, Viscount Lord Ridley, for seeing that we have a proper debate on this, and I hope the government will listen to it.
My Lords, could I, by apologising to the Noble Lord, Viscount Ridley, for missing the first few minutes of his speech. I appear to be a jinx on the railway industry just at the moment. Today's excuse for the cancellation of my train was a broken windscreen, which I found pretty unique, but I suppose, at 125 miles an hour as it was at Pendolino. The windscreen ought to be intact for the whole of its journey, so I do apologise for missing the first couple of minutes of what he had to say. I agree very, very much with what has been said, largely from both sides. I don't have any financial or personal interests to declare, although at 74, my generation were habitual smokers. I was surrounded by smokers. Both my parents smoked when I went to work for the railway industry. Virtually everybody that I worked with smoked. But unlike the noble Lord, Lord Brabazon or the Earl of Cathcart, I managed to find the willpower to give up about 30 years ago. I did it purely by terrifying myself. It became apparent that smoking and lung cancer smoking was synonymous with lung cancer, and I convinced myself that every cigarette that I lit was the one that was going to give me lung cancer. So eventually I terrified myself into stopping smoking. However, I do not understand the purpose of this SI or what will follow from it, that we are in fact going to ban products that would help people to give up smoking. Like other speakers, I do not believe that someone who is a non-smoker currently would move from vaping to tobacco. Surely it has been proved, or obvious enough, that people move the other way from tobacco to vaping, and I can't understand why the government should be so ready to accept this particular SI. That's not to say I'm getting involved in what's going to happen on the 23rd of June. But there is a group of people that I think we ought to, and the government ought to be concerned about so far as smoking in the future is concerned. I'm, as I go around the country, concerned about the number of young people who smoke, particularly the number of young women, many of whom believe that smoking helps them to stay fairly slim. I was going to say fit, obviously it doesn't, but stay fairly slim. And I think anything that would help them off tobacco would be a good thing. I've no doubt that the two medical doctors who will reply for both sides will tell us that there's no scientific evidence, of course, that smoking keeps you trim. However, I have to, again, quote my own experience. I put a stone and a half on quite quickly when I gave up smoking. No medical reason for that, of course. It is the fact that smokers are anxious to put down their knives and forks and head for the door to have a cigarette immediately after the main course. And once I gave up smoking, I stayed for the ice cream and the puddings and all the rest of it. So I want to know from both the medical profession from both sides of the chamber which will kill me first, smoking or my spare tyre, because they've warned me understandably about both. Mention has been made, my lords, by the noble Lord Callanan of the reduced risk tobacco products that I understand that the industry are looking at the present time, the heat not burn products. I understand the Chancellor did mention these products in his recent budget. I'd be interested to know from the Government Minister what the Government's intentions are. I fear that if the Treasury act in their usual way under any government, it would be another excuse to tax something as heavily as possible. But I think if we are serious about weaning, and we are serious about weaning people away from the demon that is tobacco, then to ban alternative products which are proven to be less dangerous is far from a sensible way forward. And I'd be interested to hear from both front benches as to why they apparently are supporting this particular SI.
My Lords, I just want to say a couple of words on this. First of all, I don't really have an interest to declare. I have a wife who's a very heavily into chain smoking, but I don't smoke, and I let her go on smoking because it keeps her slightly calmer and livable with. And I think it's probably better than her going on to Valium to try and calm her down. I'm a chocoholic, which is a different problem altogether. The reason I'm standing up is because I do think we should separate out in our minds the difference between the harm done from the burning of substances which we inhale and whether there is harm or not in a particular drug that's within it, which is nicotine. And if you separate those two out as two different issues, you realise that this is not the right directive, because this is about tobacco, at the end of the day, is a herbaceous substance which we dry and burn. And that's what it's meant to be about. It's not about whether or not nicotine is a beneficial drug. And I don't know much about it as a doctor, because I'm not a doctor. I read things in the press, for instance, which says that it can help with Alzheimer's and dementia, and some things which say, no, that's rubbish. I do agree with you that it definitely used to be an appetite suppressant. And one of the things I predicted when they cracked down on tobacco is we'd have an obesity crisis. It's one of the few things I've been right about. It happened very quickly. And if we want to prevent all the stomach and overweight problems, you could recommend smoking, perhaps. But still, it's a matter of which way you're going to go. The calming effect is well known for people who are quite nervous and tense. And again, I think that's the nicotine rather than the burning part of it. And the other thing is, I remember we now have signs over the motorways which says, tiredness kills, take a break. In the old days, you had a cigarette when you were feeling tired driving. I know you should take a break, but sometimes 30 miles to the next place you can stop, sometimes you're against a deadline, and it was perfectly accepted the way of keeping yourself awake was with a nicotine hit. And so maybe vaping would do that. But I do think we should not be confusing the two things, and that's the point that I really wanted to make. I think that the noble Lord Stoddard Swindon's point, it was very apt to, which is about not what's in a name. They should never have called them e-cigarettes, because they are not cigarettes. And I think that's a very good point. And that goes back to Noble Viscount Lord Ridley's point about, you've got to separate out the two issues. And I think that's where he's absolutely right. Two things just to finish up with. One is, this is a directive that we're trying to implement into UK law. It's not a regulation, which means it's directly applicable in the UK. The purpose of the directive is slightly, you should be able to modify it in light of the local circumstances while still trying to comply with the spirits of things. I haven't read the directive thoroughly, or I haven't read it at all, to know whether there should be some room for manoeuvre. And if we feel it's better for the UK population to write it into our local laws in a different way, I would hope that that amount of latitude exists within the directive to allow us to do it, and within the EU to do it. And the final thing, of course, is the conspiracy theory, which is wonderful, which is, of course, the Treasury gets huge amounts of tax from the smokers and don't from the vapors. So maybe the Treasury really doesn't want to see vaping take off. It would rather see us smoking. And the government has a vested interest, and maybe should declare that every time it tries to promote the directive. It has a vested interest in making sure this directive goes through unchanged and prevents vaping.
It's been a great debate, and I'm very grateful to the noble Lord Viscount Ridley for once again bringing our attention to this matter. It's a pity that we're in Grand Committee and not in the Chamber, but I can understand the reason for that. My Lords, I should declare my presidency of the Royal Society of Public Health, which has, of course, produced documentary evidence on electronic cigarettes. It's tempting to debate Europe, and I'm looking forward to the noble Lord Prior's view on Europe, as clearly it seems to be part of our debate, and looks like we've got quite a long time to wait this evening. I am in favour of remaining in the EU, but I would just remark that this directive doesn't seem to show much evidence the Prime Minister's claim to have negotiated a new concordat relationship with the EU. And, my Lords, on the argument that if we were outside the EU, we wouldn't be doing this, I'm very doubtful, because, my Lords, the fact is, and I speak as President of the RSPH, there are some elements in the public health world who were prejudiced from the start against e-cigarettes. That clearly influenced the Department of Health, and the reason why it's taken such a really rather mealy-mouthed approach to e-cigarettes. And, my Lords, it's simply not based on evidence at all. And it's interesting that if you look at some of the papers produced by public health bodies, there are some Weasley words around this issue about we still don't know and we need to be very, very careful. My Lords, I'm afraid these are Weasley words, and they're really trying to find a legitimisation for the initial reaction, which was very negative, and which I'm afraid has laid the foundations for where we are today. Because, my Lords, this is bonkers. I mean, it is simply madness. Here we have a product which clearly is a benefit to smokers. There is absolutely no evidence whatsoever that they will be used by non-smokers, which is where all this nonsense has come from. There's no evidence whatsoever. I mean, why would a non-smoker take up these e-cigarettes? It is absolutely bonkers. And the problem that we've got, and why I mean, the Noble Lord Stoddart and I have debated for many years tobacco issues, and he will know that I've been strongly in favour of very, very strong legislation. I moved the amendment to ban the smoking of tobacco in cars with children only a year or two ago. So, my lords, I'm not at all worried about being very, very tough in relation to smoking, but e-cigarettes are completely different. I don't understand why they're part of the directive at all. I just don't understand why they are classified in the same way. My lords, the evidence is abundantly clear that they are almost wholly beneficial. And my concern, my lords, is that it's also clear that the public are at the moment confused. I mean, my RSPH research revealed 90% of the public still regard nicotine itself as harmful. The Public Health England, going back to September 2015, say in their report, it was a joint statement they issued on behalf of themselves and other UK health organisations, and yet millions of smokers have the impression that e-cigarettes are at least as harmful as tobacco. So, my lords, it seems to me that one of the real adverse consequences of this is that as it becomes known that there are going to be these major restrictions on the promotion of e-cigarettes in the future, that all that will do is emphasise the belief that actually they are harmful. And I don't know what I mean, I've seen the RIA, but I couldn't see there any analysis in relation to the impact that that could have on reducing uptake of e-cigarettes amongst smokers. But I think it's a very important point. So, my lords, I just wanted to ask 3 points to the Noble Lord the Minister. First of all, Viscount Ridley asked him about what was going to happen in terms of investment in smoking cessation services. My understanding is that as a result of the government's cut to the grant to local authorities of public health, in fact, smoking cessation service investment is going down. And I'd asked him whether he could confirm that and say what he's doing to reverse the pattern. The second is, my lords, clearly this is going through because there is no motion to stop it going through. What monitoring is going to take place, and how soon will the government undertake an assessment of the impact, and assuming that we are still in the EU, will he be prepared to go back to the EU if evidence is clear that it's actually having an adverse impact on smokers giving up smoking? And I hope they can give some reassurance on that. The third issue is in relation to enforcement. I mean, paragraph 53 of the statutory instrument makes it clear it's the duty of each Weights and Measures Authority in Great Britain and each district council in Northern Ireland to enforce these regulations within this area. So, my lords, the question I want to put to the Noble Lord or the Minister is what guidance is going to be given to the Weights and Measures authorities about taking a light-handed approach to enforcement? Because, my lords, I really do think it's quite clear that these are not supported, these provisions are not supported. It's pretty obvious that the government itself doesn't support them because of the amelioration that they've attempted to do in terms of transposing the directive. But I think, my lords, at the very least, one could expect a message to be given to Weights and Measures authorities that actually that they do expect enforcement to be proportionate, minimalist, and certainly light touch.
Well, my lords, I don't know whether to thank the Noble Earl Ridley for bringing this debate here today or not, because I have to say the arguments that have been put have been very powerful, and it would be obtuse of me to say otherwise. Perhaps we could just start by going back to, I think, the opening words of Lord Ridley, when he said that there are 3 ways of trying to influence behaviour of people doing things that do harm. You can punish them, you can hector them, or you could try to offer safe alternatives. And in the article he wrote in the Times some time ago, he used an example of methadone as being something that is not desirable in itself, but is used as a means of treating people who have got heroin addiction. I think in the case of tobacco, we've tried all three things. We have penalised people through taxation. We have hectored them incessantly for years. And thirdly, we are now looking, well, we've tried nicotine replacement therapies, but in a way vaping is a way of trying to encourage people to use something which is less harmful than smoking. Considerably less harmful, I should say, but we've used all three ways of doing it. And I think actually most people would agree that in England, the success we've had in reducing the consumption of tobacco has been hugely successful. So I think I can unequivocally say, because the noble lord did ask for a statement, I think, of what the government's view was on vaping. We are unequivocally in favour of vaping for people who smoke cigarettes as a means of coming off cigarettes. There's absolutely no question about that. And I think the report produced both by PHE and but most recently, actually more powerfully, very powerfully, by the Royal College of Physicians, entirely endorses that view. I mean, Jane Dacre, the RCP, the president of the Royal College of Physicians, said, with careful management and proportionate regulation, harm reduction provides an opportunity to improve the lives of millions of people. That was her response to the RCP report. But I just picked that out because she used the word proportionate regulation in that. And I think that is what we're discussing today, really. It's not whether we're in favour of vaping or not in favour of vaping. It's whether it's what kind of regulation should be around it. And just on the European bit, just for, as the noble Lord Hunt couldn't resist throwing that in as one of his questions, I'm not sure that if we'd been left to our own devices, we might not have come out with something far worse several years ago, actually. And if the noble Lord was kind enough in his speech to mention the original views of PHE and the MHRA, actually, we may well have brought in a licensing system or indeed banned them altogether several years ago. So I'm not sure whether this is, whether one can lay this at the door of Brussels or indeed our own government. I think that we have been far too quick to resort to regulation in many areas, and certainly I'm wholly in sympathy, as a rule, of less regulation is the best place to start. So I think actually what we are discussing today is really whether or not this regulation is proportionate or not, and what damage it may do, or what the unintended consequences of this directive might be. I could just mention, while I have it to hand, that to put the noble Lord Bramazotara at rest, that the concentration that he's taking it at will not be affected. It will not have to become licensed by the MHRA. But sadly, I cannot say the same about the noble Earl Cathcart, whose course on his 2.4% is higher than the 2, which is the cut-off point for licensing. But I'll come to that in more detail in a minute, if I can. Can I just pick up a few of the fears that have been expressed about this directive and see whether I can allay the minds of noble lords today? It has been said that the directive will ban flavours in e-liquids. I think I should be clear about it. It will not ban flavours in e-liquids. What it does say is that flavours that pose a risk to human health should not be used. And I think probably we can all agree that is a sensible rule. There is an additive called diacetyl, which is, I think, used actually for making popcorn in other uses, which I think has, and there are some other flavours where there is some evidence that airways can be inflamed. I think we'd all agree that it would be sensible if we can. The noble lord is looking. Questioning at that, but there is some evidence. I think it was actually in the RCP report that some flavours can cause some damage. It has been said that the directive will ban all advertising and prevent shop owners from communicating with their customers. It does not do that. The new rules do not prevent information being provided to customers, either online or in physical retail outlets. Neither does it ban online forums and independently compiled reviews or blogs. Some advertising will also be allowed, such as point of sale, billboards and leaflets, subject to the rules set out in existing advertising codes, to ensure that these do not appeal to people under 18 or non-users. There will therefore remain a wide range of information on products available to smokers who wish to buy these products. Now, on this point of advertising, it will reduce the amount of advertising. I mean,
I take it that they won't be allowed to advertise on television. Am I right? But I see on television adverts, other adverts from the pharmaceutical companies, Nicorette and that sort of thing. So why on earth should these products be treated any differently?
I think, my lords, that what the directive is trying to do, and it may not be doing it very well, but what it's trying to do is to differentiate between smokers and non-smokers, and particularly non-smokers under the age of 18. So it wants to encourage information to be given to smokers, but does not want to risk the unintended consequence of normalising vaping so that other people who don't smoke start doing so. That is the purpose behind it. Now, if we find, another question raised by the Noble Earl, Lord Ridley, was about how much money will we be spending on public information. I mean, I think if there is evidence that the impact on advertising is such that smokers are not getting the right information about switching to e-cigarettes or vaping, then I think there will be a very strong case to be made for a public information campaign to correct that. But I think we'll have to wait and see to see the impact that the directive does have on advertising. It has been said also that the directive will ban certain types of product and make those available less effective. No current type of e-cigarette will be banned. In addition, I think it's worth noting that this is a fast-growing and innovative market. I think, actually, I read somewhere that Goldman Sachs had put vaping down as one of the 8th most disruptive products being marketed in worldwide at the moment. It is a highly disruptive and innovative market. We don't know how many products there are, but it's somewhere between up as many as maybe 25,000 different products in this market. It is a new and very dynamic and innovative market. So we are persuaded, or officials are persuaded, that there will be still, after this directive comes through, there will still be many, many products on the market. Concerns have been raised about the cost of notification. These are the products that are below 2 milligrams per mil. The MHRA has announced the feed for notification will be £150 per product. There's been leading work with our partners in other member states and UK industry to develop and publish pragmatic guidance on the reporting requirements to minimise the burden on business. So we'll have to wait and see, but I don't think it will be right to assume that there will be a massive diminution or a significant diminution of the number of products in the market. Lastly, concerns have been expressed about the limit of 20 milligrams per mil, which will not meet the needs of smokers who are most addicted, and they will be unable to benefit from the harm reduction potential of these products. Again, this is not the case. Higher strength products can still access the market after May 20th, but they will need a medicines licence. And indeed, the government would welcome a wider range of applications for licensed products. The Noble Lord Ridley said that there was one at the moment, which is true, and it's not being properly marketed, but the government would welcome more products in this space, so they can be made available to those like the Noble Earl Cathcart, to those who need and will benefit from them. We know the most commonly purchased products are below 20 milligrams per mil. We don't know the exact number of those above that limit, and that this strength of 20 milligrams per mil or below meets the demands of the majority of current users and balances the risk of exposure of nicotine to children with the needs of users. Last week, the European Court agreed with this assessment, ruling that the provisions set out in the Tobacco Products Directive, including those limiting strengths, were proportionate and valid. I think where we are with this directive, it will be a massive unintended consequence if, as a result of this directive, fewer people gave up smoking. It would be. Sorry. Yeah. Well, it will be.
My friend, allow me. It may well be unintended. I wouldn't know what is in the intentions of the curious people who devised this, but it is certainly an inevitable consequence, and it's the consequence that matters, not the intention.
The intention of the regulation is to make vaping safer and less variable than it currently is. And by making it a better product, causing more people to use it. That is the intention of the directive. If it does indeed result in smokers not giving up smoking, then it will have achieved the reverse to what the government wishes to do. Because we are absolutely clear. The government's view is clear that we wish people to give up smoking. We wish them to quit altogether, is our intention. But as a way of quitting, if they can give up smoking and take up vaping, that is something that we wish to do. Of course, I understand that nothing I could say today is going to satisfy noble friends and noble lords in this House. But I have done my best to put our case forward. Yeah.
He's very graciously giving way, but it's interesting that he used those terms. There is this reluctance to sort of promote vaping, isn't there? Even in the words he used, it's a qualification. So the government will prefer everyone to give up smoking, but if not, then they're kind of half-hearted. It sounds like there's a half-hearted. Now, I understand why they're in that position, but the issue that I raised with him is that the evidence is the public are actually confused. And my concern is that by taking this measure, and if Weights and Measures authorities do enforce this in a heavy-handed way, it will confirm the public's view that actually there is something wrong with vaping. I mean, for goodness sake, if we could persuade all smokers to vape, it would be such a fantastic public health movement. Why have we got this hesitation? I don't understand it.
I think the hesitation comes because for a number of years the evidence around vaping was not clear, and many scientists, distinguished scientists, it wasn't just the tobacco lobby, many distinguished scientists felt that it was harmful or potentially harmful. It is absolutely clear now, and I said this earlier on, that I'm unequivocal about this, that vaping is far, far more preferable to smoking. That doesn't alter the fact that quitting altogether from smoking or vaping is probably the best outcome.
Both the Noble Lord Callan and I mentioned the heat not burn products. I know, strictly speaking, they're not covered by the SI, but they are covered by the legislation emanating from Brussels as a whole, as I understand it. And as the Chancellor did mention in his budget that he was looking at this alternative, what is in fact an alternative to cigarettes at the present time. I wonder if the Minister could comment perhaps on the Government's intentions in future.
Well, this is on the taxation point.
Yes.
I'm not aware of any intentions to tax these products. But I will ask further about that question and write to the Noble Lord, but as things stand at the moment, I'm not aware of any intention to do so.
Hunt has now twice mentioned about the Weights and Measures enforcing this in a heavy-handed or a light touch. Can the Minister just comment on which he thinks they will do?
The enforcement will, can I put it this way, will be more Italian than traditionally British.
Question about taxation. I wonder, I understand, of course, that the Noble, I'm obliged to him for giving way yet again, but I understand he has no power over taxation, but he does, as a part of the department, have the opportunity to recommend to the Treasury. Would he be prepared to ask his department to recommend to the Treasury that they should not put any tax other than VAT on this particular product?
Well, so I'm not responsible for public health in the Department of Health, but I will talk to my noble friend, my honourable friend Jane Ellison, who is the Minister for Public Health, and put that view very strongly to her.
My Lords, I will be very brief because I know that others are waiting to start another debate. I'm most grateful to all noble Lords who have spoken in this debate: Lord Brabazon, Lord Callanan, Lord Cathcart, Lord Stoddart, Lord Snape, Lord Errol, Lord Hunt, Lord Pryor. I'd say to Lord Snape that I think he looks in extremely good shape to me. He didn't get his the advice that he was looking for on his health, but and I'm not medically qualified, but he looks fine to me. And I do.
What are his medical qualifications for reassuring people?
I withdraw the advice. I would agree with both the noble Lord Stoddart and the noble Lord Errol that we do need to change the vocabulary here. And indeed, I do actually myself now use the phrase vaping device rather than e-cigarette whenever possible, because I do think it makes more sense and it's a shorter word for a start. I was also fascinated to learn from the noble Lord Errol, or rather to recall how one kept awake on motorways before Red Bull was invented. I didn't realise that cigarettes had that effect. The noble Lord Hunt, I think, has put his finger on it, that there is a real issue of public confusion still. We've seen it in opinion polls recently, that people have increased their suspicion of this product over the last couple of years because of the misinformation studies that were cited by others. And the issue of harm is a very tricky one to get across to the public, because you cannot say these are absolutely safe or that they're good for you, which conceivably, they're certainly good for smokers, but are they good for in the absolute terms? No, but that's not the point. The point is harm reduction. The point is relative harm. My Lords, I had wanted originally to put down a regret motion to express somewhat stronger dissatisfaction with this directive and the way it's been moved into law, but the best chance of getting a debate before the end of the session was to take note, and I'm sure that the House therefore does want to take note. Just a couple of other very quick points. It was mentioned by my noble friend Lord Brabazon that smoking is a very regressive thing at the moment. It's done much more it bears down much more heavily in terms of cost and indeed in terms of suffering on poorer people than richer people. It's no longer an equal opportunity killer, as you could put it that way. But I am most grateful to my noble friend the Minister for a very different tone in his response to when we first debated this, maybe I think 2 years ago in this very room, not from him but from his predecessor, and for his very unequivocal statement that this is a good thing for smokers to take up vaping. And I also am very encouraged to hear him make the point, and I will press him on this as we go forward, that although this directive prevents advertising, it does not prevent a public information campaign to get the point across to smokers. And I think that with that and the promise of Italian light-style implementation, do I withdraw my, or take...
Beg to move.
I just beg to move, that's the phrase, thank you.
Question, is this motion be agreed to? As many as are of that opinion will say content. Contrary not content.